So just for you guys to know, welcome to our Ticker Talk. As you guys know, these are usually done with industry leaders. Michael is definitely one of them, which is pretty awesome and amazing to have him here. So thank you for sharing your time with us. We're going to take the first kind of like 10 to 15 minutes. I'm going to get out all of my questions because, you know, I'm a little bit of a fangirl of you, Mike. And so I definitely want to, kind of think operations look like, and sort of best principles and all of that, all of that you've done, and grown, different marketing departments. And then I'm going to open it up to the group. For those of you who it's your first time, usually functions is you just unmute yourself and you ask a question. There's two people who have unmuted themselves. I will choose who the winner is, and then the other person will go next. It's pretty organic. If you have a dying question that you're like, oh my God, if I don't get it out, I will forget it. Feel free to use the chat, and then we'll just kind of queue you up to ask that. You can ask, probably like 1 to 2 quick follow-ups, and we just want to make sure that we give everyone an opportunity to ask their questions, so that it doesn't turn into a two-way dialogue, because that can sometimes happen. I know we get like really excited and passionate. Usually we go pretty quickly. Everyone will get a chance to ask at least one question. And then Mike, I know you wanted to kind of talk through just a little bit of your background just to give everybody a little bit of context, so that would be great.
Yeah, so I promise no more than 2 minutes. Let's see if I can keep to it.
Yes.
So just, by way of introduction, I've been in the advertising space for about 20 years, in a few different roles. I sort of came into it by way of a company that was doing personalization, where I was the CTO. My background is much more on the technology side than on the marketing side, so I sort of grew into the marketing side of all of this. I went from there to TripAdvisor, where I led two parts of our efforts. One was around the advertising we did, and we did quite a lot of it. It was mostly SEM, but we also had big display programs, social programs. I was also involved with the media side and the measurement and optimization on our TV advertising, and I was there for 8 years. And I've been at Uber for 2.5 years, where I'm in kind of a similar role, responsible for performance marketing across all of our different businesses. So that includes our mobility business, which is rides, the sort of traditional Uber you think of when you hear the word Uber, delivery, which is Uber Eats, which I would imagine most of you probably heard of. We have a freight business as well. And then within those, we have different areas that we market to. So we have consumers, so riders and eaters. We have earners, so drivers and couriers. We have merchants, so these are restaurants and others whose food or whose goods that we deliver to consumers. And then we have a freight business where we have shippers and we have carriers. So it's quite a mix of different types of business areas. We draw the line at Uber between performance marketing and brand marketing, in terms of how we think about conversion. So for us, performance marketing is about getting a user who is actively shopping and ready to buy to actually transact, basically to order, to take a trip. And anything that is further out, where we're creating awareness, consideration, we're getting people ready for that when they are finally in market, that we think about as more on the brand side or demand generation, mid and upper funnel. Last thing I'll say, my team is a cross-functional team. So I have data scientists, I have marketers, I have technical product people, I have analysts, kind of a whole mix of different types of skills, engineers dedicated to supporting the work that my team does. It's a total of about 450 people, 300 of whom are the first group that I just mentioned, and then about 150 software engineers that are supporting the work that we do. It also includes CRM, which is basically all of our communications with our customers. So that's email, it's push notifications, it's SMS, it's any way that we are actively communicating with our customers. And then areas like SEO, CRO, which is about optimizing conversions for users who arrive at our website or in our app, are all also areas that my team covers. So that's me. I don't know if I stayed to the team. I think I went a minute over, but close. Um, Juliana, it's all yours.
You're all good. And so one of the first questions that I have is around visibility to the team, right? Because you have a large team and structure. What does it look like? Um, how do you make sure that the team is performing, and doing everything that they're supposed to, given the
That's
large size?
that's a good question. We are sort of fortunate on the performance side to be in an area where it's relatively easy to measure the impact of what we do. And so we think about sort of everything that we do in terms of the revenue that we generate for the business. And we think about it with a kind of a cost constraint or an efficiency constraint. So we work with the business to agree on what we call a ROAS, or a return on ad spend target, for each area of the business in each market. We're a global company. We do business in 40 or 50 different countries. So each of them have a series of these different ROAS targets. And then we measure our progress based on the amount of business essentially that we can bring in at that ROAS target. So we don't think so much in terms of fixed budgets. There is an exercise where we will, at the beginning of the year, kind of forecast what we think we will be able to spend. The business does get more and less aggressive over the course of the year in terms of how they think about kind of the rate at which we're spending, but largely the idea is to buy as much as we can at the efficiency that we decide that we're willing to pay. So, if I sort of think about how I measure my team, I try and keep everybody focused on the goals that we set collectively. So each team has its goal in terms of revenue impact. For some of the teams, the revenue impact is indirect. So I have data science teams, for example, who participate as part of a cross-functional team, but the data science team itself is not directly generating revenue. We work in a model where everybody is working cross-functionally. So for SEM, we have a team that includes marketers, it includes technical product people, it includes engineers, includes data scientists. And so everybody has, in general, a pretty good idea of where we stand. We have dashboards and emails that people can go to. The emails come out every day that sort of show how we did the previous days. And so, it's very much sort of driven by the performance, by the numbers, basically. I don't know if that answers your question, Juliana.
It does. Which is great that you have visibility on the numbers, and then how. And I know that the easy. So when you're looking at a team member who isn't performing, are you looking at a month's worth of underperformance, at a quarter's worth? I guess, how are you measuring the individual team
So
members'
we don't
performance when
generally
you're
hold
looking?
individual team members accountable for revenue. We're doing it more at the sort of team level. When we're looking at individuals, we're looking at all the same stuff that anybody would look
Mm-hmm.
at in a sort of corporate environment. We're trying to understand, we think about what we call the what and the how. So the what is, what is this person actually achieving? The how is how do they achieve it? How do they interact with other people? How do they collaborate? Are they sort of forward looking? Are they very reactive? And we have a process. If somebody is, in general, we try and give people feedback on an ongoing basis. If somebody is underperforming, the first step is making sure that they understand and that they're getting coaching, if the coaching is appropriate. Usually that helps, and that, usually the problems are resolved that way. Sometimes they're not. And if need be, if it gets to the point where there's either a fit issue, and sometimes there is a fit issue. I inherited a team that was not sort of quantitatively driven in the same way that we are right now. And so a bunch of people were hired into roles that were really very different roles than the ones that they ended up in after we restructured our team. This all happened, right after I joined at Uber. And so sometimes it's just a fit issue. People are doing work that is not the work that they signed up for. And, everyone is better off if they either find another role within Uber or they leave the company and find something somewhere else. Other times people need to be, managed more directly. And, so it's very much sort of individual by individual. And it's based on, like I said, both the what and the how. So what are they getting done and how are they
Yeah,
doing it?
absolutely. And I believe it was something like 400 out of 1,200 employees, like in the marketing department, were laid off, and there was a whole restructuring in Uber, like right before you got there, right? And I know for a
It
lot
was
of
right
the
after
leaders
I
in
got
this
there,
group,
actually.
oh, it was right
Yeah,
after you
I
got
was
there. Oh,
involved.
how
Let's put
fun.
it that way.
So, yeah, because like when I did my research, the conversation around that was very vague, and I'm sure for
Well, you just,
reputation
I mean,
purposes.
and you want
So,
to sort of protect people's privacy. I mean, there's not much you can
of
talk about
course.
publicly in a situation like that.
Mhm. So, and I'm just curious, right? Because as leaders, we're usually, we're dealing with churn of a few people a year,
Yeah.
right? For people in this group. When you're dealing with that massive kind of churn, how do you, like, what are one of the things that you think were your key learnings around how to keep up morale, how to make sure that, employees that were staying were in the right, right seat, right person for the right seat, and just general takeaways around managing churn. I mean,
Yeah,
because
sure.
we're talking about like churn at huge volume, right? Versus a few people. So I'd love your insights on
Yeah,
that.
sure. So why don't I give you sort of two answers here? The first is I'll give you a little bit of a background on exactly sort of where things were when I got there and how we ended up being in a situation where we decided to eliminate a third of our marketing team, and then how that went, basically. And I'll also talk about how we deal now on an ongoing basis with attrition, in other words, and morale. How do we make sure that we are doing what we can? Because now we're on the other side of it. We're trying to minimize the amount of churn and attrition that we
Yeah,
have.
absolutely.
So just does that sound reasonable? If I give you those two?
That sounds perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so on the first one, so Uber, before I arrived, most of you probably, sort of read all the news stories during the Travis era. There was a sort of a long and sordid history where, the company grew very rapidly for a while. In 2017, ran into a whole bunch of culture and other issues that are, that were, frankly, a lot of them derived from the sort of the CEO and the way that he managed the business. The business grew in a very decentralized way. So each time Uber went into a new city, they basically created an entire mini business in that city. That included operational people, it included marketing people, it included, sort of all finance people, all of the different functions that one might want in any given city, which is fine if you're trying to be scrappy and entrepreneurial and get going very quickly. It means that you have a relatively small team that can work together, kind of like a startup would. And, Uber was doing things that, frankly, were sort of operating at the edge of what was legal at the time, and so needed to be able to respond quickly. So it kind of made sense as a strategy. But what we ended up with were literally hundreds of these small marketing teams with really no specialization. So it was, 2 or 3 or 4 people doing the best they could across a whole bunch of channels with no underlying technology support, with no product support. Imagine like we were getting no benefit from the scale of the business. And so, and this is all, sort of before my arrival. And so in 2017, they tried bringing all these people together into regional teams. There were 4 of those. One for Latin America, one for US and Canada, EMEA and APAC. They then went to a more centralized model. They weren't really ready to do it. That lasted about 6 months, went back to the regional model. Marketing became, quite sort of distributed across multiple areas of the business. So there wasn't like there was a sort of a single marketing organization and all the marketers sat there. Rather, there were people all throughout different parts of the business who had, marketing competencies and responsibilities. And so I came in the middle of 2019, and there were 4 of these regional teams. Each of them really commingling brand and performance. There wasn't really a very meaningful distinction. They essentially had budgets for each. And then, when somebody wanted to run a campaign, they just looked where there was money available. And if there was money available for performance, they called it performance. And if there was money available for brand, they called it brand. And none of it was measured, and so people would sort of launch these things, check off the box, and then move on. And there was no sort of way to optimize anything. And frankly, they weren't given the tools to do it anyway. And so, it was not good. Company was spending at the time about somewhere north of $1 billion between the two areas. And frankly, nobody had any idea what we were getting for that $1 billion. And so that's sort of where I walked in. And so these 4 teams, each of which were hundreds of people, were all doing the same things, but differently. So there were 4 of each for each marketing channel, for search engine marketing, for social, there were 4 of each. And they didn't really share any learnings with each other. It was just kind of crazy. And, I fairly quickly came to the conclusion that it was sufficiently sort of broken that it wasn't really repairable. It was really a matter of figuring out what we wanted the new structure to look like, building it and then transitioning from the old one, rather than trying to repair the structure that was already there. So we spent the first sort of 3 months figuring out what that new structure would look like. That took us from like July through into October. In October, we downsized the team significantly. So at that point, there were about 450 people. These are just the marketers without the engineers. And we took the team down from 450 to about 300. We also went from this regional structure to more of a global structure where we had regional support people, but they were operating within this global structure. So on this one day in October, we had roughly, we went from 450 people down to about 300. And most of them, say 280 of them, were in new jobs on the same day, and left to sort of figure out how to transition all of these campaigns and programs that we already had running to this new structure. So it was kind of a mess, quite chaotic for a few months, but we sorted through it. And so we went into the new year in 2020, actually, in reasonably good shape. We were then, we had sort of launched this new structure. People understood what to do, and then COVID hit. We were fortunate that we had decided to focus on the delivery business, which is Uber Eats at that point, because that is the more competitive of our 2 main businesses. With mobility, we are largely the leader in any given market, and we usually only have 1 competitor. So like in the US, we have Lyft. Lyft is about half the size that we are. If I compare that to Uber Eats, where we're competing with DoorDash and we're competing with Grubhub, and it's a much more sort of equally distributed shares of the pie. And so advertising is relatively much more important. So we had already made a decision that we were going to really focus on Eats. COVID hit, and it turned out that was a good decision because we basically paused the whole rides business, and we devoted all of our effort to Eats. So that's kind of how we got to and dealt with all of that sort of change. You use the word churn. I'm not sure I would use the word churn, but it was definitely, because it was deliberate change that we were creating. And there was a bunch of attrition that followed all of that. I mean, inevitably, when you make a lot of change, you're going to have attrition that will follow because there'll be a bunch of people who don't like the change. And I would argue that's generally healthy because let those people go find places to work where they're going to, get what they want, rather than trying to force them to adopt something that may or may not be a good fit for them. And so there's this natural process where people will leave, and then you'll replace them with people who actually want to do the kinds of work that you need. And that happened for us. So that's sort of part 1 of the answer. Part 2 of the answer, in terms of now, how do we think about churn and attrition? The answer is it's very challenging in this environment because there's a labor shortage. Basically, we have a big team in San Francisco where that, sort of competition for talent is particularly acute. So about half of my team is San Francisco based. We are now distributing more. In fact, we're actually building a big presence in New York City because we find it much easier to hire in New York because there are so many financial institutions in New York. So people who are doing the kind of, who have the skills we want, but working for like banks and other, like sort of less sexy kinds of companies. And so our sort of currency in that respect, which is like not so great on the West Coast, where we're competing with all these venture funded startups and we're kind of old and stodgy. You come into New York and we look pretty good, and so it's much easier for us to recruit there. And the base of talent is actually quite good. So we have a growing New York presence. That's probably the place where we're most focused on growing now. So part of it is like sort of distributing the work geographically so that you're in the places where you've got sort of, a healthy balance between supply and demand for people. And then part of it is also making sure people are in jobs, that are interesting for them, that where they're, developing their careers appropriately, where there are sort of explicit career development conversations that they're having on a regular basis with their managers. And, some of that comes from sort of Uber and our HR team, and they provide a fair amount of support there. And some of it comes from, my team and the managers on the team. But that's all, fairly sort of well understood and standard stuff that you just have to do. So anyway, so does that help in terms of the answer?
No, absolutely. And I'm going to open up the floor to anyone who wants to ask questions. Michael is full of information, so yeah, definitely let's geek out a little bit.
Hi. Oh, go ahead.
All right, I'm going to choose Jan.
Hi, Michael. Thank you so much for joining this. I had an executive question. When you're looking at that much chaos and that much change, so I was interested in your approach to change management when you've got that degree of
change.
Do you have like an internal guiding principle, like this level of chaos is acceptable and this level is not because I've got some critical path?
Well, we actually went through a bit of a debate. Do we do this in steps or do we do it all at once, basically? And we started down the process of doing it in steps. So I mentioned that we had these 4 regional teams and we were going to merge 2 of them and then merge the other 2. So we would have gone from 4 to 2. And then we would have had to figure out a way to merge the other 2. And we sort of realized that the sort of the cost of doing that was not worth the sort of the benefit of a slightly more gradual transition. It was still going to be a lot of change, but it would have been a lot of change over a much longer period of time. So one of the principles was just get it out there and be done with it, as quickly as we possibly could. When I got there, this was a major restructuring of all of marketing. Everybody knew that there was change coming and nobody knew what the change was. So time was not on our side. Basically, anybody that was working there probably was, starting to look for a job because they weren't sure whether they were still going to have a job. And so we had to move relatively quickly. We didn't want to move too quickly because we wanted to make sure we sort of thought this all through. It was quite complex what we were trying to do. So we took 3 months. I'd argue that was probably, I wouldn't have wanted to go too much longer than what we went, but I probably couldn't have done it in too much shorter a time either. And then the second thing is once we started doing it, transparency is just really important. Explaining to people what you're doing, why you're doing it, what your goals are, so that they understand, and answering their questions honestly. And we tried to do as much of that as we could. A lot of people have this sort of innate tendency to not necessarily be completely open with people about what they're trying to do. We tried to avoid that like the plague, basically, and help people understand exactly what we were trying to do and why. And I would say for the most part, it worked relatively well. I, inherited, like I said, this massive people that was, not very effectively managed from all over the organization. So as you might expect, when we did these internal surveys, the survey scores started out at a very, very low base, well below Uber overall. We're now a bit above Uber overall, and that's been, sort of a gradual progression over the 2 years since we did that reorganization. But a lot of it, I think, is just being honest with people and helping them understand sort of the vision. Where are we trying to get to? How are we trying to get there? And what is their role in it? In other words, the impact of the work that they're doing. And so slightly long answer, but does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Tim. You had a question.
Cool. Thank you, Michael. So you mentioned earlier you do a lot of campaign or media buying on a ROAS basis. We hear this from a lot of folks that are doing like ROAS or CPA based marketing, that like paying commissions. I don't know if you guys are 100% internal or not, but when folks are bringing in an agency or multiple agencies and they're running those like ROAS CPA type campaigns, they're like paying out commissions and keeping track of who owes what is a nightmare. So I'm just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit. Like, how do you keep control of this? Because I imagine the budgets are enormous, and the number of ways you're trying to hit those ROAS numbers are like very.
So we think about with like the sort of commissions and fees we pay, and we pay a lot to a lot of people in various forms. So we pay for work on our creatives. We pay Google for, some of the work for some of the tools and infrastructure that they provide. We pay agencies. Mostly in sort of specialized areas that we work. We generally think of all those fees as, when they're based on the spend, which mostly they are, we think about those fees as just part of the spend. Like I don't really care whether we're paying an agency or we're paying directly for media. What matters is the total amount that we spend. The ROAS calculation is basically just revenue over cost, and the cost is the sum of all the costs, which includes commissions and whatever else. And so, what we're looking at is, if we add in an agency in a certain function, basically, the agency may or may not make us more efficient. If the agency does make us more efficient, then we're better off with the agency in all likelihood. When you do that ROAS calculation, your ROAS will actually improve. It'll go up if you're able to generate more revenue for the same amount of money. And so we don't really think about, we don't think of them as two different pools of expenses. We think of it as a single sort of pool, and we're somewhat indifferent to whether we're spending on agencies or tools or anything else versus spending on media.
Right. We hear sort of like two schools of thought on this. One is, which is like, we hire agencies, we give them 15% of spend or 10% of spend, or we have some payout mechanism based on total spend. If they work, we keep them. If they don't, we fire them. And then there's another school of thought which says, like, we want them to have skin in the game. So like, if they can take our cost per acquisition down by 10%, then we give them a bonus. If they can bring it down by 15%, we give them an even bigger bonus. And but they're like, the overhead of doing that is very large. We have to bring out all of our accountants and lawyers every quarter to figure out, well, what is the payout? How did they perform? And I'm wondering, like, we're starting to look at like systems, like what software or companies that manage that sort of payout and commission.
Yeah, no, it's all right. So we, in general, where we use agencies, they're fairly specialized. So I'll give you some examples. For earners, we do a lot of advertising on job boards. So these are places like Indeed.com and ZipRecruiter and Snagajob. There's like probably 50 of them. And so we work with an agency there that helps us sort of manage all of those relationships and the campaigns and everything else. But it's an agency that's really just focused on job boards. So there, we pay them a percentage of the spend. We don't do it based on, sort of a CPA target. So it's sort of closer to your A than the B. But we are sort of on an ongoing basis actively asking ourselves, are we getting what we need? Do we actually need the agency to do this? We're actually, in that instance, we're actually moving now in the opposite direction. We're actually taking on some of the larger job boards, and we're going to be working directly with them. So Indeed.com is where we're starting. And we're going to be, sort of reducing the role of the agency. We don't generally use the sort of the latter model, because we don't generally outsource kind of all of the work to an agency. The agencies are, we use other agencies just for creative, for example, and if the creative that they create for us doesn't perform, then, we stop using the agency. But we're not thinking about it as, the agency needs to hit a certain performance level and that we're paying based on that performance. This is just us. Again, keeping in mind that the majority of what we do, the vast majority of it, we're doing internally, with our own teams. And so where we bring in agencies are in areas where we don't have that sort of specialized creative is a good example of that. Like it's hard to hire the right kind of creative people in a company like Uber, and so we don't have big creative teams. We mostly outsource that. Does that help?
It does. It does. We hear a lot of enthusiasm for the latter model, but then a lot of like trepidation where people just say like, I just don't know what I'm getting myself into. Like it's easier just to pay people 15%, and if they work, they work. If they don't, we fire them. And we really want them to have skin in the game, but they get really scared when they think about like, well, how are we going to calculate their commission?
It also doesn't really work very well if the agency, both sides are not sort of set up to measure in an efficient way, and that's usually not the case. Most agencies, their strength is not technology, it's not measurement, in my experience. There's the rare agency that is sort of competent at it, but mostly they're not, and it's sort of outside of their core skill sets. And then most of these companies, most of the advertisers are also not very good at it. And so you have a model like that and you're just sort of asking for trouble, in my opinion. It's because you're going to spend a lot of your time just arguing about, what the results actually are. And so like I would say in general, we would probably never go that path. Put it that way. But we have the option of doing it end to end ourselves, which, a lot of advertisers don't.
Next.
Yep.
Oh, I'm in and out.
Sorry.
Yeah, you're back now. We can hear you now.
Next person who has a question.
I've got one. So as data privacy laws evolve and we go from a third party to a first party tracking world, so to say, have you guys done anything? Or are you currently doing anything?
Yeah. Yeah, no, this has been a huge issue this year, particularly with Apple's changes that they made, earlier in the year. Our work gets harder. There's no question about it, as we're like able to track less and less at the individual level. We expect the trend to continue. Google has said at some point they're going to get rid of third-party cookies in Chrome. There's no date for it yet. The dates that they have set, they keep pushing out. So we're hopeful that they'll keep pushing it out. The big part of their business is dependent on it. So wouldn't surprise me if they were to. But the trend is clearly in the direction of sort of making it more and more difficult for us to track. And so we are investing a lot of effort in doing the best we can with what we do have, and you can still, you still have a fair amount of information at an aggregated level, but, frankly, like these Apple changes, there was a lot of stuff that was just like not fully baked, even when they made the changes. And it wasn't for months afterwards that you could even start testing some, so Apple has something called SK Ad Network. I don't know if you know what that is, but basically that allows you to get aggregated results. And it didn't even exist until, literally right about the time that they launched their changes, much less, sort of have anybody actually know how to use it, get the bugs out of it, and so we're making progress, but it's been a fairly big effort this year. I would say it has impacted our performance, not in a catastrophic way, but it's created a drag, I would say, and it's required a lot of effort that, frankly, we would rather have spent on other things, but you don't have a choice.
Are you developing internal tools? Are you looking for like third-party customer data platforms to integrate?
Both. We're working with third parties on, the sort of tracking and attribution piece of it. And then we have our own technology for, measuring incrementality, for example, and then, pulling together the actual sort of real-time view of the revenue that we're dealing with and the activity.
Okay. Appreciate it.
Cool. Next. Who is up?
Can I throw another one in?
And if any, yeah.
We obviously the privacy thing is probably like the biggest conversation in media buying right now.
Yeah.
And again, we probably hear like two schools of thought on this one. One is, oh shit, right? Like who's going to fix this? How can we get back to deterministic advertising?
You're not going to. Is the answer.
And that latter school says, cost per acquisition's up like 20%. You know, like
we actually, our view is that for us, this actually creates opportunities, because if you have, I have 30 analytic people and another 40 data scientists on my team. That gives us a competitive advantage relative to advertisers that can't afford to make that kind of investment in using the tools that we now have, and sort of trying to get as close as we can to what we used to have in terms of the deterministic, results. And so, so we actually think it sort of skews things in favor of the larger, more sort of technology-centric companies with the change. That's just sort of the way that we're looking at it.
You look at things through the lens of like a budget or like an audience, as opposed to saying like, well, how many ads does it take to convert a customer, and which channels do I need to like orient my spend on top of? You're saying, listen, we spent $1 million last month. I don't know what the budget is. We spent 100 grand last month. We spent 100 grand this month. Same techniques. And
yeah, we basically look at it more through a CPA lens. So in other words, we have a conversion event that we care about, be it usually it's an order or a first trip that a user will take, and then we look at, as a sort of first order thing, we look at what is our cost per first order or for first trip. We do look over a longer period of time as well. So we have models that go in that sort of predict, based on the data that we have about any one user that we acquire, what do we think that user will do over the next 2 years? And that predicts an LTV for that user that we then use to decide how much to pay for them. We lose that now when we don't have that data at the individual level. So in the old world, we might have known where you came in from. In other words, where did you click on an ad? What was the ad? What did you do after you clicked? Now we don't have that at the individual level. We have for groups of people. We know they came in from this campaign. We know that the group as a whole performed in a certain way. And so it's harder for us to make those predictions at the individual level. We can still make them at the group level, but then how you define those groups turns out to be really important. If those groups are sort of random collections of people from across your audiences, you're not going to be able to predict much other than the average. If they, on the other hand, are defined in such a way that you're picking out people who are like very different from one another from group to group, then you should be able to do better predictions. This is the kind of data science problem that I'm talking about, and so there is, both an art and a science to using this, new technology that we have for looking at aggregated data. So let's take SK Ad Network, which is Apple's thing, as an example. They have a limit of 100 campaigns total. If you're advertising on Google or Facebook, Google wants you to hold back 15 of them for their own use for optimization purposes. Facebook wants you to hold back half of them. So you have either 85 or 50 to work with across all the different sort of campaigns that you're running with. How do you group your campaigns so that you have 85 different groups that are all, as different from one another as you can make them, basically? Because if they're all the same, then you might as well just have one. Right. You see what I'm saying? And so that becomes, sort of a technology challenge, and you need people who sort of know how to deal with data and work with it to solve a problem like that.
Right. I think in chaos like this, everyone gets really panicked and they start looking at like every model under the sun. And when we talk to folks, we're measurement companies, so we try to get people focused on just one thing. Just pick one. Let's say like, if it's going to be aggregate cost divided by aggregate acquisitions, or like, audience cost.
You can't optimize for everything at once, if that's sort of what you're trying to say. Like you got to pick something that you care about. And you can have a constraint. For us, it's usually revenue. We're trying to maximize revenue, and with an efficiency constraint. In other words, that, we're not willing to pay more than a certain percentage, ROAS.
Did you have a question?
I got another one.
Sure.
Wait. I want to give somebody else a chance.
Sure.
Aaron, you have a question. Ami was in here and I saw her on mute. I just wanted, is she still here? Did she go? No,
Yeah.
she unmuted
Nope.
and then
Yeah, I'm back. Sorry about that. I have a little bit more of a tactical question, Michael.
Sure.
All right.
Being in the travel space for a long time, I wanted to understand your views, and that this may not be relevant to your current
Yeah.
role, but it may have been when you were more with the travel.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on hitting networks that, in other words, buying media directly from a website or a network versus trying to hit them through something like programmatic?
Well, it's interesting. It depends which hat you want me to wear. If I were still a TripAdvisor, we had a
Right.
display business where we sold premium display inventory at like $15 CPMs, and I would have told you if you were sort of a brand advertiser and you were trying to reach our audience with display ads, that would be the right thing to do. But for a performance advertiser, I would never give that answer, because it was just too expensive to be able to sort of use that inventory efficiently. And so in general, I would say, and again, I'm sort of just giving you the performance side of what we do. I'm not giving you because we buy very differently for our brand advertising.
Yeah.
Where we're buying based on frequency, and it's all much more traditional media buying. For performance, it's pretty much all performance based, and fairly highly optimized. There are places where we can't do that. Those job boards that I gave you as an example, some of them are fairly crude, and so they give you very limited sort of choices in terms of. Some of them even only allow you to make one bid for the entire site, as an example. And you just do the best you can with what you have to work with. In general, I would say, on Google and Facebook, somewhat unsurprisingly represent a big chunk of our spend. Google far bigger than Facebook, and we're using most of the time their automated bidding products rather than bidding on our own. We've learned that they have data that they can use that makes them more efficient at it than we are, because they know, user search histories, they know a lot more about where people have been browsing. And so if they can use that data when they bid on our behalf, they can do a better job. So pretty much on the performance side, everywhere it can be, what we do is programmatic. We're not buying in the sort of traditional CPM-based reach and frequency. If we have no choice, then we will, but it's sort of last resort. Does that answer your question?
Completely. Thank you. Yes.
Okay.
All right, Aaron.
Yeah. So when you came into the company and you let go of all the people, you mentioned that everybody was kind of siloed, nobody's really communicating, big gaps in data, you're kind of blind to stuff. So aside from the people, what technology innovations did you do to make sure to unify that conversation and thought?
No, it's a very good question. So it's not that the company didn't try. So I had a team of probably, that point is probably 20 product managers, managing the work of these 150 engineers. And they were trying to provide technology support, but because of the way the business was structured, all they could do, literally, everyone in every part of the business would come up every 6 months with their own list of sort of things, that their wish list, basically, of things they'd like. And they were all disconnected. And there were literally thousands of these sort of items on these wish lists. Every time, and they sort of spread. What the teams would try and do is give everybody a little bit, basically, but nobody was ever sort of looking top down and saying, all right, well, what's going to really move the needle here? Should we make an investment in automated bidding, for example? Should we make an investment in how we do our attribution, in experimentation, in whatever it may be? Okay. And so none of those big investments got made. Instead, there was a bunch of little stuff that people were building that, frankly, nobody other than the person caring about it, requesting it, cared about, and so it was extremely inefficient. So we changed that completely. So we now work sort of the opposite way. We have focus areas, and I'll give you some examples. Marketing self-service is one of our focus areas. We're trying to get to a point where people within the company can do more on their own without having to come to my team and specifically ask for things. And so then we think about that, within that focus area, what are the things that we can do that will help us progress? We need to, what are the types of tools? What type of infrastructure do we need? And then we leave some room for these kind of bottom-up requests, but that we try and keep them to about 30% of our total capacity. So we're spending 70% of our engineering time and our product time on the things that we think are going to actually make a difference, when we think about these focus areas top down. Does that
Thank you.
help?
Yeah, absolutely.
Next person.
I was going to chime in and ask some questions about how a team of 450 people communicates and keeps tabs.
Sometimes not very well. So it's an interesting question. It's broken down into sub areas. So I'll just kind of give you the broad areas, and so you get some sense of like how the team is distributed. So if I think about it from like sort of a business perspective, there are groups of people that are dedicated to each of our sort of broad areas of business. So the mobility business, the delivery business, the freight business, that's probably a total of about maybe 50 people in aggregate. Broken down though, some of those people are regional support people. So probably half of them are in region supporting different parts of the business. And then the other half have a more global function. Then we have teams that are focused globally on individual marketing channels. We have a global SEM team. We have a global team for Google, for UAC, which they're now calling Google App Campaigns, which is their product for buying downloads. We have a social team. We have the job boards team, as I mentioned earlier. Those teams together are about another 50 people. We have another probably 75 data scientists and analytics who are supporting these different areas. We have probably something on the order of 100 people focused on CRM. We have sort of two parts to CRM within our team. Part of it is marketing-driven CRM, where we're measuring ourselves in the lift that we drive, and part of it is sort of CRM as a service for the rest of the business, because there's lots of reasons you need to communicate with customers that don't always have to do with marketing. So for example, the pickup area at your airport has changed. We need to let somebody know that there are various things like that the business needs to get out. And so we sort of manage that as a service. We have the product managers themselves. There's probably another 30 people there, something like that. We have SEO. We think about that as a separate team because the nature of the work's different. That's another probably 20 people. So the communication problem gets sort of subdivided. So if I think about what we're doing for eaters, for example, the people from those LOB teams need to be involved. There's usually somebody from one or two people from the data science and analytics team. There's people from the channels teams. And they're communicating with one another as a group, basically. And then we have a leadership team that's about total of about 30 people that cuts across all these different areas. It's everybody that's at a certain level or above. And we meet in person. We've been doing this since May, about every 6 weeks. And we talk as a team about sort of what's gone on since the last time we met and sort of what we want to be doing between now and the next time that we meet. Then on top of that, we have Slack, and we use Slack pretty heavily. We obviously use email. So all of that said, it's not perfect, and especially with COVID, and people not in offices, that makes it all the more challenging, because you basically now have to make an appointment to talk to somebody. You can't really have a spontaneous conversation other than on Slack. And so the way that people interact with each other has really changed. And, frankly, I don't think for the better, I think for the worse. And so it is a challenging area. It's one that, our team is very distributed. I mentioned, about half the team is in San Francisco, but the other half is all over the place: New York, Amsterdam, Sydney, Mexico City. And so that creates challenges as well. So communication is incredibly important. It's something that we're always thinking about. I would say it's something that we're evolving at. I would not claim that we're terrific at it yet.
Nice. Good answer. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay. I think we have.
I see Will.
Can I just
Will?
go? I was waiting for Juliana to say, Will, go ahead.
Juliana's internet keeps going in and out.
Okay. Gotcha. So, Michael, one question I have is on the different programmatic platforms. I've been kind of experimenting with other ones, and I wanted to get your take on
Sure.
if there are any better performers, Roku or Trade Desk, than others. I know Jeff Green came out with that new, well, it was like, what, 6 months now that he came out with a new one. But I just, from a higher level and obviously more spend on those, what's your
Yeah, I mean,
what's your take?
honestly, like, we're sort of over invested in Google. We do test
Okay.
others, and we do use others. Google has this sort of unfair advantage because they can make this investment in all of their infrastructure and the support that they can provide that the others can't really do. It's harder for them. They're also, when you're talking about display, also the thing you have to be super careful about is fraud, because there's still a lot of it. And so you're never quite sure of what you're getting. And, so Uber has like a lot of sort of PTSD around this, because I don't know if you know the history, but very sort of public, lost $100 million in fraudulent advertising. This is long before I ever got to Uber, but there's still lawsuits going on that I now got dragged into to try and recover some of it. We were able to recover probably a third of it, but we lost 2/3 of it. And so it is kind of the Wild West. And so I would say, whereas if you're working with Google, you don't really have to worry about that stuff. Google's not going to be engaging in fraud. And so our bias basically, because the big concern is just the inventory that you have access to, so Google is not the entire world. There's a lot that's not on Google, and so how do you get access to the rest of that?
Right.
But we try and focus on fewer ad networks, and so that we can do more with the ones that we do support. At TripAdvisor, we use Criteo because we were doing a lot of retargeting. We had good experience with them. At Uber, it's mostly Google. We kind of completely rebooted our display program about a year ago. We had been trying to buy directly using our own bidding algorithms. We had a real-time bidder, and that was a complete disaster. And so we just killed the whole thing and started over again with Google, and that's been very successful. We're doing, I don't know, probably 50 times the volume we could ever do with the real-time bidder already, at sort of better efficiencies.
Is that just because Google, you would say, has probably the longest reach in terms of like an ad network?
They have the longest reach, and their products are like relatively mature. They have a lot of data about users that they can use that others don't have, and so they, as I said, I think they have sort of an unfair advantage. And, I don't love the fact that we're contributing to their monopoly, or duopoly, but the reality is if you're trying to get sort of the best value for what you do, that's probably where you want to start.
Okay. Do you think though and sorry, as a follow-up question.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
So, you got it's like first right of refusal, I think, right? Is that why you also are tapped into Google? Because if there's no inventory, if the inventory isn't being served by Google itself, it's going to go to other, DSPs, or DSPs are also going to get the same claim to it. Do you think really it's like a one-on-one, like that's a real-time bid, or do you think Google kind of services its own advertisers first? You see what I'm saying?
They're all black boxes, and so you never quite can know. I will tell you that this was sort of early days when I was at ChoiceStream, and we were building this ad targeting business that I mentioned, that we were trying to build these products that were making sort of quantitative decisions about what to pay and where. And what we discovered was that what people promised and what the actual sort of products did and the data that was there were very different from one another. And the products, like many of them were, and these were like sort of big auctions, big ad exchanges that were like fundamentally broken in like very basic ways, because nobody had ever really paid attention to whether they were working or they were not. That was a long time ago. That was more than 10 years ago, probably. So these things have matured since then. But, so the way we view it is, how much volume can we get from a given ad network, given what we're willing to pay? Do we care that like a given piece of inventory is on one network or another? Not really. It doesn't really matter. What we really care about is what does it cost us to get whatever traffic it is that we're trying to buy. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's a sort of a different perspective on it.
Well, and you're basically saying we don't care where it's coming from. We just care about the overall cost. And yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And Google obscures that. You really don't know where it's coming from, for the most part. They don't actually tell you other than very broad strokes.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, Michael. Appreciate that.
Yeah, no problem.
Time for one last question.
I got a follow-up if nobody has another question.
Let's see. I think you win, Will.
Cool. CTV. Are you guys really diving into that as well?
CTV. You're talking about like addressable television?
Yeah, connected TV. It's
yeah. So I am involved. The answer is we use it for optimization and for testing and experimentation, but it's generally very expensive compared to, like national media buying for television. If you look at it on a CPM basis, you pay a pretty heavy premium. And so we use it where we can take advantage of the targeting that we can do with it. And then we try and take what we learn there and apply it to what we do nationally, if that makes sense.
No, it does.
We're, frankly, early days.
Yeah, no, for sure. I'm curious to know, I mean, a national media buy, I was always under the impression that it's still more expensive than a CTV.
Depends on what you're buying and how you buy it. You can buy, like in the upfronts, and you can buy just, premium inventory, or you can buy remnant, or, there's a lot of different ways to buy media. But in general, addressable media is fairly expensive, if you sort of look at it apples to apples to something that is, like sort of more national scope.
Got it. Okay. Good to know.
Michael, and I hope you guys can hear me. I have lasting question. Are there look out for?
We're losing you, Juliana.
Hey, Juliana, you want to type it in? There you go. Trends to look out for in 2022.
Is this for me, the question?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the big one is just the continuation of all data privacy issues. That's the elephant in the room here, I would say, because you don't quite know who's going to do what and when, and you want to be ready when they can. And we're really only getting started. So that's probably the single biggest and most important one from our perspective.